Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. It's Miles here, and today we're going to talk about my personal Dragonflight wishlist. Now, this is stuff that I'm really hoping that gets implemented going into Dragonflight, and this is for all sort of areas of the game, but obviously mostly focusing at the raiding or maybe the M+, more competitive side of things, because that's really where I've got my head. There's nothing to do with PvP or anything like that, or any mount farming, mostly just raids and a bit of M+ stuff. So I've played a bit of Dragonflight Beta so far, and I've played some of the raid testing bosses, and it seems really good so far, and I'm really enjoying it. However, there's a few things, mistakes that I personally think were made in Shadowlands that could definitely be rectified and could definitely be done better going to Dragonflight. So first off, I have more variety in the meta. So I found personally that the meta for especially Season 3 and Season 4 were really sort of set in stone what was super good. You know, you had Destro Lock, you had Demo Lock, you had Survival Hunter. There was, you know, a handful of options that were just incredible, and some options were just really, really bad. I felt like, you know, if you looked at the best spec in comparison to the worst spec, the difference was just far too, I guess, in between those two, and like way too much of a difference. My personal opinion is also that I think everything should be playable at the top level, but I feel like if you're playing, you know, a raid full of useless classes, you would have seriously struggled, to the point where I actually think that some fights pre-nerf would have been practically impossible without really meta comps. I'm not a massive fan of this, and it also means that people that play those characters specifically are having a lot worse of a tier, so I'd really appreciate if they made more variety in the meta. And you know, this also goes for M+ as well, especially. I think M+ has the biggest issue with it. And it doesn't just go for tanks, this is DPSs mostly, to be honest with you, because I really don't like seeing basically the exact same DPS specs every single time that I go into, you know, raid, or just like go to logs and stuff like that. Like, I'd really like to see a bit more of a variety, things being a little bit closer together. And I think the way that Blizzard need to go around tackling this is not by not introducing huge changes like the tier sets. I think the tier sets were a really struggle to balance, which is why we had such a massive imbalance in that patch. So I really do hope that they go around and try and, I guess, pivot in a way that isn't going to add anything massive during the patch, or, you know, make fights which are perfect for something like a Boomy, like there was with Council of Blood and with also Sylvanas for the whole of P1. I'm just not a massive fan of practically requiring some specs for some fights, really. It's just not, I'm not a fan. I'm really not a fan. It's not fantastic to me. However, next up, we're going to have enjoyable yet shorter raid bosses. Now, I've liked the raid bosses for the most part in Shadowlands. I think they did a really good job with a lot of the design for these bosses, and I think they've been really like good with some of them. Like some of them were very what's the word, original ideas. Like Sylvanas was a completely original fight. Like, we've not seen anything like Sylvanas. So it was a really cool fight to see, and I really liked that, especially because of the fun and the variety of bosses. Bosses didn't feel too much the same. However, the bosses were very long. You know, looking at Sylvanas was sometimes up to a 13-minute fight in one boss. And, you know, you've got even other bosses that were leading up to these final bosses. Now, I'm fine with final bosses being a bit longer, but 13 minutes was way too long, you know. That means if you had a good pull of Sylvanas during prog and you wipe towards the end, you've wasted 12 minutes. You know, if you compare that to any other boss where you got the similar pull, you'd be able to fit 3 of those similar pulls of any other boss in. So it's not, to me, it's just not fantastic. To me, those long fights aren't great. Kel'Thuzad, also a very long fight, and it was a very repetitive fight. I didn't really enjoy that one either. Fate Scribe, quite a long fight. You know, we had Council of Blood was still quite a long fight as well, even though it wasn't really a last boss. And I'm just not a fan of these long fights. I'd really much rather have a really difficult 5-minute boss fight, or maybe 4-minute boss fight, than have a medium difficulty boss fight that's going to last 8 minutes. Because I find with those boss fights, you know, when you make mistakes in a longer boss fight, it just feels so much worse because you know that you have to go through all of that again, especially if it's, you know, one that doesn't have necessarily super hard mechanics, it just has a lot of them. Like, I don't think personally Sylvanas Mythic, there was mechanics that were really, really difficult about Sylvanas Mythic. It was just the fact that the fight took so long that to practice P3 mechanics took you, you know, weeks and weeks and weeks just to get to P3, because it's practically like going through a boss and a half just to get there. And then once you're there, you then have to get there consistently to be able to practice those mechanics. Like, I don't think the mechanics were difficult. I think it was just way too much of a grind. I keep using Sylvanas as an example, that's because it is a pretty fantastic example of way too long of a raid boss. But there is quite a few others, so I really hope that they make the bosses a bit shorter going into Dragonflight. And also, it will just make prog a little bit quicker. I'm a bit of a fan of making prog a little bit faster. I didn't really like Sepulchre and how you had to spend weeks and weeks and weeks on you know, just like getting down a few bosses. It's not ideal for me. I would much prefer a shorter raiding tier. Next up is more interesting tank mechanics. Now, I feel like tank mechanics are definitely better than what they were before in going into Shadowlands now. However, I still feel like tanks can very much be just a move the boss here and hit the boss, and that's it. And I feel like some bosses it's done incredibly well. I think Jailer was a great tank fight. P2 I think was probably the most enjoyable experience I've had tanking. Granted, pre-nerf was one of the most difficult experiences I've had tanking, but that's enjoyable. That's really fun. There's a lot to do as a tank on that fight. And also, if you look at some other bosses, like what's a fantastic example? Side and Athreus. Also, you have quite a lot of responsibilities at tanking. You have quite a lot of stuff to do. However, you know, when we now look at fights like Council of Blood, you stood there and you hit the bosses, and that was it. You know, you look at other fights, and basically, I'd say about 60% of fights right now as a tank is literally stand there with the boss. What's Zimox? Zimox, and this is Castle Nathria Zimox, is stand there with the boss and do nothing else. And to me, I don't like that. I really don't like just sit there with the boss. It's not fun. I really wish that they will implement more interesting tank mechanics into raid bosses specifically, really. I don't mind too much in M+, it just being a tank and spank, because again, I kind of like, I sort of lead my groups that I'm usually in on comms with friends, so I guess it would work out technically for me, but I'm not sure about other people. But go back to raid. I think, I don't know, I think it's looking better, definitely. The bosses that I've tested, the tanking mechanics look better, but they don't look great still. I still think that a lot of them are going to be tank and spank, so I really hope that they either change this, or maybe they add some more in the future, or the other bosses that we yet to test are less of just a, you know, tank and spank. Doesn't really matter where you are, it doesn't really matter what you're doing and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, this is quite a big one for me, at least, because Jailer had, I think, fantastic ones tank mechanic wise. Sylvanas was also probably one of the most enjoyable experience tanking. Running around and picking up as many pulls as you possibly can was so fun. Like, seriously, I cannot like look at some of these end bosses enough, but they are so fun for tanks, and I just wish that even a fraction of these end boss tank mechanics would just get like highlighted a little bit on some of the earlier bosses, because I do feel like tanks are sort of forgotten sometimes when it comes to bosses. Next up is going to be less quote-unquote required weekly activities. Now, I put the quote-unquote there is because, you know, obviously realistically you don't have to do anything weekly. At the same time, you could just do one Mythic Plus and a couple bosses and whatever, it doesn't really matter. However, to get the maximum output right now, you have to do 8 Mythic Plus dungeons, 8 raid bosses, and obviously we don't really worry too much about PvP. Now, 8 Mythic Plus dungeons is a sizable amount of time. It's not loads, don't get me wrong, but it's a sizable amount. So for someone that wants to have quite a few alts, you know, if you want to have 3 alts and gear them, you know, equal to people's mains, it takes a lot of effort to gear that. It takes a lot of M+ grinding, you know, sitting there and doing weekly 15s for the entire day. And personally, you know, I don't mind the amount of time that I have to put in too much. You know, the time isn't necessarily the problem, it's just the having to do weekly 15s. 15s aren't enjoyable. When you're on your 5th 15 in a row in the last 2 hours, you're bored out of your mind, because the 15s can be incredibly boring. And granted, you can do higher dungeons, but that's just going to take a hell of a lot more time. So I find when I've got alts, I'm literally just sitting there doing this weekly 15 grind on them, like on a Monday or Tuesday night, and I'm just thinking to myself, like, God, I hate this. This is so bad. I'm really, really not a fan. So I'd really appreciate if they maybe lowered the requirement down to something like 6 Mythic Plus dungeons and 6 raid bosses, which I really hope they will, because they are reducing the amount of bosses in the raid, so I do think they will reduce the raid amount. I would be very surprised if they kept it at 8, because that means you'd have to full clear the raid to get your slots, or you'd have to go and do it in 2 separate difficulties. So that would be a bit peculiar, to say the least, if they did that. However, I guess I wouldn't also necessarily be too surprised. But I do hope that they lower the M+1, because I really am not a fan of sitting there. And granted, I'm going to have quite a few alts going into Dragonflight, sitting there and grinding, I guess, just endless amounts of 15s in the first few weeks is just not going to be enjoyable for me. I know a lot of other people that simply, either struggle with, the sort of 15, 16s and tend to stick a bit lower, like much more casual players that don't have too much time and can't do these 15s, so feel like they're getting cucked a little bit because they're not able to do this content all the time. Also, people just have jobs. If you have a full-time job and you get home and you raid twice a week, and you're only able to play like 3 other nights a week, you're going to struggle to get all those 15s in, especially if you have an alt. So I do hope that it gets lowered. And generally speaking, we always have other weeklies that we have to do, which usually take up a good majority of time. And if you want to do that, if you need to rep grind or anything similar to that, and you need to do those weekly quests, you need to do it on so many characters. It's just not fun. I'm not looking forward too much to weekly grinds, and it could potentially even be more with the profession system. So I really hope that they reduce the amount that you need to do. That would be really nice for having alts. And also be less boring of just grinding 15s all the time. And last but most definitely not least is visually better mechanics. Now, I genuinely feel like if you look at Nyalotha, I feel like visual mechanics were very easy to see. Really nice, very obvious what was happening, like what was, something not to stand in and what something was to stand in. And you know what, in Castle Nathri it was still really good. There were still like really obvious things, like, okay, this is really obvious what's going on, this is really, visually appealing and visually, like, I know what's happening here. But then then you compare it to Sanctum of Domination, it gets a bit worse. There's a few things that are like, okay, that's a bit of a struggle to see, or that's not correct. And they took a bit of a step back there, and then they released Sepulchre, which had such awful visual mechanics. I hated it. Like, I think being able to see the stuff in Sepulchre was awful. Constantly having to change our PC settings just so I can see mechanics better in certain rooms. It's just not a good idea. I'm really not a fan. I really hope that they turn this around and they don't decide to overlap red mechanics on red floors. I really hope that they do go back to sort of using a lot more of white swirlies and stuff like that on darker floors, because it's so much easier to see. So I think that for me at least, that's a really, really, really big one. It happens in dungeons as well. Spires of Ascension had definitely some problems visually. So I really do hope that in Dragonflight, it's so much easier to determine what's something that you can stand in or can't stand in, or just be able to see on the floor. And also some boss mechanics, I feel like we really had very little, I guess, just from looking visually without any sounds, without looking at any bars, cast times, timers, literally just from looking at the mechanic happening. Some of them were a little bit more on the difficult side, I guess you could say, to see. So I really do hope they do a better job of that. But that's it for the video today, guys. Let me know what your thoughts are and what your wish lists are, I guess, in the comments below. And remember to like and subscribe. And anyway, I'll see you all in the next one.